Thank you, Joey. We're going to call this work session for August 23rd, 2022 to order. First order of business, we'll call the roll. Alderman Barnhill.
Here.
Vice Mayor Blanton.
Here.
Alderman Hanson.
Here.
Alderman Peterson.
Here.
Alderman Berger.
Here.
Alderman Brown.
Present.
Alderman Potts, not here yet. Alderman Baggett.
Here.
And the mayor's here also. Next is an opportunity for citizens.
Mike.
Do I need to call the roll again? Everybody's here except Alderman Potts after we call the roll. So next is an opportunity for citizen comments for items that are not on the agenda. As you know, we use speaker cards to let me know if you want to speak. I have none. So I need to do a little housekeeping before we get started. Item number 5. I want to start item number 5 sharply at 5:15, and I will stop everything at 5:15, no matter where we're at, to get started on that one, because we anticipate about an hour and a half on that. Okay? So the first item on the agenda is Cool Springs Adaptive Signal Control Technology before and after study.
So this is something we implemented last June of 21, and we've done some study to show you the impact of adaptive signal technology, and Adam and Paul will talk you through that. Thank you.
You have 1 minute.
Go fast. Sorry, it's not going to be explained very well.
Please, dumb it down for the rest of you.
And all those,
You have more than a minute.
I'm just kidding, initials and everything. I thought, what are you?
Well, luckily we got some results back. We got some results back from the before-after study. We massaged those a little bit, had to do a little bit of data collection to make sure we got everything as representative as we could. So the problem that, for those of you that don't know anything about the adaptive system, the problem was that we had some unpredictable traffic in the Cool Springs area. Mallory Lane, Cool Springs Boulevard, Galleria, as you have all been out there, you know that shopping and vehicles and things can ebb and flow and get pretty congested. So some of the solutions we looked at were more timing plans, go into a traffic responsive, which is kind of a slow ramp up. After 15 minutes, it looks at traffic and then makes an adjustment. And then adaptive signal control. So adaptive signal control lets it go a little quicker when it's making decisions and move up and down. We did get a grant award of $1.6 million in 2011. The design took a while. It was TDOT's first stint into adaptive control, so there was a lot of back and forth with how to handle it. And then we completed construction in June of 21 last year. So we chose what's called SCOOT. Cycles, it's an acronym. So it does certain things best for us. We are trying to balance the reduction of delay as well as traveling down the corridor, trying to reduce that delay. SCOOT is detection intensive, like I like to say. The stop bar calls the green. It says, hey, I'm a vehicle, I'm here. Give me some green. The advanced detection, that measures the cues and how it's approaching the intersection. And then there's something called filter detection, which is after the stop bar. So it kind of deducts cars as they pass over those detectors. Right turns, left turns. We also have to put them where there's private properties because we can't put advanced detection on private property. So the before-after study, we looked at the 3 corridors that we put it on, and then we specifically studied 3 intersections for delay and queuing. Delay and queuing studies are intensive and costly, so we only did 3 major intersections on those. So the measures were stops, how often you have to stop, your speed, your travel time, queues again, like I said. And then, of course, with the CMAQ grant, which is the air quality grant, we have to do emissions and say, okay, how much emission reduction is achieved with this. So the before data was started in October of 2019. COVID hit. Then we redid it in September of 21. And then we did the after data in October of 21. So let's look at some results. We'll look at Cool Springs Boulevard first. So here's your greens and your reds. Reds, red bad, green good. So overall, you'll see that there was a great reduction
in travel time for westbound. That's in seconds. And then we had to add, well, luckily only 1 second on the weekdays going eastbound on Cool Springs Boulevard. Our delay increased a little bit, as you would expect, with the reduction in travel time. The weekend was a little bit worse, not too bad, but the overall benefit is there. We've reduced travel time and reduced delay on Cool Springs Boulevard itself. The next one is Mallory Lane. This one's a little different. Southbound actually got a little worse on the weekend. And overall, it was actually worse on the weekend, running adaptive. We've made a few changes, and we think those changes in the last few months have actually gotten that better on the weekend. I love working on weekends, so we come in here and do some work on it, as you can imagine. I know. Traffic's awesome. Galleria Boulevard, whatever, except for traffic engineers.
Adam loves his job.
So southbound here on the weekend, the reason on Galleria, the reason why it's actually got worse was we're actually flipping, if you know the signal at Galleria and the I-65 off-ramp, we're actually cycling that faster. So what that does is obviously when you come off of 65, you're probably going to experience more delay, but we are actually servicing all the traffic a little quicker there. So that was the reason for that one. And that one's gotten a little better. We've worked on that a little bit too, but the main reason is we're cycling a little faster back and forth. So this is an intersection that we looked at for queuing and delay all the way around, all the movements, left turns, throughs. Those other 3 corridors I showed you were specifically throughput on the main corridors, studying the main corridors. So we wanted to look at all movements at those 3 intersections that I mentioned before. This is just one of them. I'm not going to run through all 3. So in the AM peak, those were the approximate queues, average queues, not every cycle. That's sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small. So the average queue there for the AM peak before, and then the average queue after got better. So our queuing decreased in the AM with the adaptive system, as well as most of our delay. PM peak, again, this is the average, because I know everyone's been through there in the PM peak and they know it's bad. So this is over the course of 2 hours, 4 to 6 p.m., the average queuing. And again, we got better with the exception of the northbound right, actually got worse. We're doing a few changes on that. As you know, if you've been through there, there's a double right now. But at that time, it was pretty bad. So we'll continue to try to get that one better. We have the vendor coming in, and we're going to look at that because the queuing is a little bit worse in the northbound direction. So the actual overall benefit cost analysis that our consultant did, Gresham Smith completed this for us. They did looked at the cost of the system to implement, our maintenance cost, and replacement of the detection over 10 years. So in the average life of those detectors is about 10 years. They're wireless magnetometers. You drill a hole in the pavement, pop them in, that's got a battery, lasts about 10 years, 8 to 10. So they'd have to do a amortization of replacing those after 10 years. What did that cost? So the overall system cost to get it to an annual fee over those 10 years. And then we did the benefits. So labor, gas, all that stuff, how much that saves based on all the study data that we got. So if you reduce delay, we reduce our gas. If we increase decrease our travel time, you're not sitting in traffic as long, you're not idling. So that's kind of those dollars there, that value. So that's the benefits, which is an overall, for every dollar spent, we got a $5 benefit out of it. Now, I will say that we didn't study delay on every single intersection. What you see here is main corridor benefit. So that's the benefit of the actual traveling down Mallory, Cool Springs, Galleria. So if I'm sitting on the side street, that money does not put into effect that. So But we did do some, like I showed you, some study on that. We saw that the reduction of delay in queuing. So we're pretty confident that that's a pretty good number there. We do think that might, if we studied every single intersection for delay on all the approaches, it might move that a little bit. But for overall, we've had a pretty good benefit with the system. Just an overall example, this was in February of this year. We went from, I don't remember what day it was. We went from a 70-degree in February, and it dropped down under 40 degrees. We thought we were going to get ice. School was canceled around noon. The traditional time of day is that 140 gray line. The Scoot system is the blue line. And then a typical day in Scoot is the orange line. So this is our old timing, which would have stayed at the same thing during that day. A traditional day, same day of the week. And then this is when the school got let out. Parents went and picked up kids, and then the volume dropped. So as you can see, the Scoot system also dropped with it. So that was a good thing. That's what we wanted. We wanted the cycle lengths to get shorter, reduce delay, things like that. So that's a good example of that. With that, hopefully I stayed within my time frame.
You did great. Thanks, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
How about it, Alderman Brown?
Two questions. One, does the system, now that we have this data, does it have a predictive ability? So are we able to say if we add X number of volume on Cool Springs, for example, this is what we would expect to happen to go forward? Will this be included now in how we evaluate traffic and all that?
Yeah, so let me just go back one. So we cap this system at 160 seconds, which is how long it takes to go all the way around, all the phases, all the greens. If we could let it go, and it would probably move up. So as traffic grows, we'll probably release it a little bit and let it go up a little bit. That does obviously increase a little bit of delay on side streets, left turns. But yes, it is predictive. It does store historical data. So if we lose, let's say we lose comm or we lose detectors, something happens, it'll use historical data and that it collects every day. So it is pretty predictive on that. It would rather use live data, but
Sure.
if something goes wrong, you can do that.
And my second question was, and you kind of answered it, I think, 'cause by saying we didn't really test a lot of side streets. I would think that if there was reduction in wait time and all that in the main corridor, we're pushing those seconds to the side streets. Maybe that's not correct, but I would be curious on some of those side streets that come into those main corridors, have we increased that wait time versus, not, we're flowing the main traffic, but are we reducing the wait time or increasing wait time elsewhere?
Yeah, the good news is we think it's servicing the splits. So in other words, even though it's at a higher cycle, it should, and we've seen this, is that it'll service the side street longer than what our traditional timing plans would have done. So if it says, oh, there's more queue here, on the next cycle, it'll give it more green time. So you might have a little bit of delay in that first cycle until the system can figure out, oh, there's more people here, I need to give them more green time. Our old system would have said, this is your green time, this is all you get, if there's more or less. Yep.
Vice Mayor, and then I'll get Alderman Baggett after that.
So I know that we're talking about these three different roads or what have you. With this grant, is there opportunity, is it just fact finding and then we implement it in other areas? Because, we all can think about Patrick, what's your least favorite intersection in the city of Franklin? What's the long range plans for implementing this type of system in other areas?
Well,
Is it all about this?
yeah, it's
Okay.
mostly money and maintenance. The detection intensive, I wanted to show you how intensive the detection was because that's not typical. And so when you have that kind of detection, it costs money and it costs money to fix. So I've been doing adaptive systems, luckily, before I got to Franklin for like 20 years, used 6 different systems. You don't want to put it everywhere. One, it's too expensive and it's useless to put it in places that it's not beneficial. And 2, you want to make sure you have that unpredictable traffic. A lot of our roads do have fairly predictable traffic, believe it or not. So as of right now, you know, as we develop and get things going, maybe that changes. But yeah, you want to put it where it makes sense. And there's other tools in the toolbox that we can use. That State Route 96 CMAQ project we have coming up,
Sure.
Murfreesboro Road.
Yeah.
We're going to implement something different and kind of do a compare on it and see.
Well, and even think about the growth that's happening over on Bev's ward when you're looking at Lifetime and just that whole, you know, area right over there, that's gonna see a lot of different, I think, patterns.
Yep.
Once that gets built out. So,
Yeah, I would agree that we might be able to expand or find another system or something like that. Scoot's been around since the 80s. It is difficult to deal with. It's actually a difficult system. I'm glad I have David Chang. He's my other engineer, and he's kind of taken that on and has been playing with it and doing different things. And so you really do need somebody, even though it's a computer and thinking and making changes, you do need somebody there to know how to operate it.
technology is great as the person who operates
That's
it,
right.
right?
That's right.
Well, and while we're here, I want to thank you for the stop sign in Steve Grubb at Culberson and Petway. So
Yeah.
we do great things around here. Sometimes it takes a minute to happen, but thank you for that.
Yep, no problem.
Alderman Baggett.
I've expressed this to you before, but third in margin, would love to see this there. It may not be this, but I mean, but ask for you to explore whatever, I mean, you know, technology that might exist, because it does get backed up both in front of Mayor's home and then down to O'More, Franklin Grove, and, you know, we got a lot of problems on margin, but I feel like that stoplight, anyway, just wanted to publicly say that explore any type of technology, because clearly the return on investment, and I've said this before as well, like, we're paying all this money for roads, but our return on investment on this smart technology clearly makes those road dollars go further. And so we'd be remiss not to be a leader in this field because of the investment. More and bigger roads may not be the best always use of taxpayer dollars, and I think this has demonstrated that. So thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I've been calling my alderman for weeks about this. Alderman Berger.
Well, real quick, thank you so much. We needed this so long, but I just have one comment. We have a policy on this board about connectivity, and I would just remind all of us to really make sure that we're constantly requiring connectivity. I don't think we do a very, well, I don't want to say good job. I'm not sure it's fair to say we don't do a very good job, but we don't do maybe as well of a job as we should with connectivity. And the more connectivity we have, the more options people have. Because when I come down near that road where Brandy was talking about just a moment ago, you know, I have like 5 different ways I can go. And if I see traffic, man, I would rather be driving than sitting still. So I will just, you know, but there are little shortcuts all over the place because there's fairly good connectivity in that area. But we just need to have more connectivity, and we need to make sure we pay attention to that, because this is where 10 years from now, people are going to say, oh, wow, we sure could use connectivity. So this is my comment. Thanks.
Go ahead, Alderman Peterson.
In comparing connectivity and thinking about downtown, remember downtown has the river all around it. It has the railroad. And so there are really not the options there that you would have at other places.
Oh,
And so please keep in mind. In fact, I realized that other places that I had lived, on the main roads, you had at least 1 or maybe 2 roads parallel to that to get somewhere. But, as I say, with the river and the railroad, there's really not that opportunity.
Alderman Barnhill.
Connectivity has not been an engineering issue. Has it? Connectivity has been a political issue. And every time connectivity has come before the board, we voted against it. So, and you keep it up, keep bringing it to us, and we'll keep hammering on it and keep understanding what it does and why we're so much into it. But we voted the other night not to have connectivity. And we voted out of an entire apartment complex, one entrance off of Del Rio. And so, thank you. I appreciate that. But don't let connectivity not enter into this conversation, because we hear you. But there's always a tendency for some to vote against that.
Especially up the major roads.
Anybody else? I did have one question for you, and I think the fact that it's taken 11 years, and you mentioned some of the reason it took so long, but at the level of the Transportation Policy Board and also at TDOT, we're all concerned about how long it takes money that's dedicated to projects to be spent. And so I'd love for you to look inwardly at what the holdups were, not necessarily on our, I mean, if we had holdups, let's know about them, but the holdups on the TDOT side too. We have a new commissioner, and there may be some new opportunities to push things a little faster and a little harder, so.
I will say local funding is easier and faster to spend than local programs, TDOT. The red tape with federal dollars it goes a long way, so a lot of back and forth, so.
But maybe a conversation
Yeah.
later about some of your ideas, how we might have gotten this done sooner.
Exactly.
Thanks. Anybody else? Okay, Amendment 1 to City of Franklin Contract 2022-0062, a procurement agreement between the City of Franklin and Phase 1 construction for improvements to the event facility at Eastern Flank Battlefield Park in the amount not to exceed $46,340.91 for roofing improvements.
Yeah, we're basically adding some roofing that makes sense to do and to do all at once to the project. So hopefully this,
Has
Improve
anybody
that,
been
gets it
out
done.
there to see the pretty gray walls on the outside?
it's coming
coming
together.
along nicely.
Yes, very well.
Good report. Anybody else?
Thank you, Lisa.
No problem.
Consideration resolution 2022-51, a resolution declaring the intent of the City of Franklin, Tennessee to reimburse itself in a not-to-exceed amount of $26,150,000 for certain project expenditures with the proceeds of general obligation bonds, notes, or other debt obligations to be issued by the city.
Mr. Mayor, and respect to your time goal, I would suggest we do item 4, since we deferred that last time. And if we have time to do 3, great. If not, we can bump that. There was a pretty comprehensive presentation made on that at the Budget and Finance Committee meeting a week or so ago. So if that would be okay with the board, that might help us stay on
Perfect.
track.
Because I thought you were pointing at 4 whenever you pointed that out to me, so my error. So we want to do the Franklin zoning ordinance annual update, who we put off last time, and they were so gracious not to say bad words about us. So we're going to defer 3 to the next.
If we have time, we can
if
come back to 3, but I'm thinking we may not.
Good,
given this.
okay.
Good evening. We'll try to do this quickly, as we know there are other important items on the agenda as well. But this is the annual zoning ordinance update, and we presented this presentation at the July Joint Conceptual Workshop, but we wanted to make sure that we got BOMA feedback as we finalize the ordinance to present to Planning Commission next month in September. So we have a list of proposed amendments that we'll walk through tonight, and then we'll come back to that list and then get feedback and questions, if that's all right. We'll start off with the state model floodplain update.
Good evening. In an attempt to keep this moving, this is going to be pretty short and sweet. The city is required to adopt the state's model floodplain ordinance. We can have more stringent requirements, but not any less stringent. And the state has updated their model ordinance, so we do have to update ours as well. The changes that the state's ordinance has made is really just adding detailed descriptions of terms and definitions and some clarifications on existing requirements. It's not adding anything more stringent than the city already had in place.
They still have not put a new flood map for us.
And can I just take that comment one step further and say, not for discussion right now, but I would love to have us have a discussion about doing our own maps if we're not going to get those from there. We're getting ready to do Envision Franklin. We're getting ready to look at our long use plan. And I think to sit and be in wait, I would at least like to have that conversation at some point if we could.
Keep in mind that the FEMA maps, though, are what people have to base everything on. Sorry.
So speaking of floodways, great segue. Thank you, Alderman Brown. Thank you. So basically, I'm going to talk about parking in the floodway with parks. As we've had this discussion of looking at, currently it's not allowed, but in the floodway fringe and in the floodway, we can develop parks, but you may not develop everything you would see at an active ball field or an active park. And so there are so many times in which we do not have those rains, that high flooding areas, to where you could utilize those spaces for our community, for our citizens, and even during special events. One of the areas that I'd like to speak to you about, and before I get there, is just for those that might be watching, Pinkerton Park is one of the areas, or Aspen Grove and that type of thing. That's in the floodplain area. We might have the floodway fringe in some of those areas too. They're more passive parks, what we consider. So when it does flood, and they do, in certain areas even year-round, it will raise and then it will slowly descend. But in the floodway, such as Aspen Grove around Spencer Creek, maybe at Lewisburg at Canoe Launch, or even Bicentennial, you actually have movement of water. And so you have to plan for those things. But there's so many days in a year that you do not have the water. So that's where I would like for you to consider of making this proposed change. If I may, Kelly, the next slide. So Bicentennial is one of these areas. We currently have close to 56 parking spaces designed that will be going through our design and bid by next month for this particular project. And we currently have close to over 50 spaces on the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard Avenue through that area. The goal is to add an additional 56 spaces into this area. So you would have close to 100 in our downtown. Again, being part of Public Works as part of the Parks Department, we do close the streets. We do make those closures, and we can act as a public entity. But being able to utilize this for our citizens when it's not flooding would be a tremendous help. You will see other parks and areas in the horizon, such as canoe launches, Robertson Lake in the future, maybe even Southeast, that you will see to where this policy kind of, since it's not allowed currently, it does kind of hinder us moving forward.
Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
So, obviously, I support this, but I guess, and I know how forward-thinking we are as a staff, when you think about the type of surfacing or the type of product that's used on a floodway fringe, are we gonna modify that because we know it could be flooded? I mean, you don't wanna do something in a place and then know that it could flood, and then you're having to start repairing and going back to square one again.
Well, it used to that we did a pilot program with the dam area when we took out the dam on Lewisburg. And so in certain areas, it works with pervious concrete or asphalt to
Right.
allow for that water. But what we have found out is it will continue to fill, no matter how much you vacuum, actually, no matter how much you clean. So what we have found out, it actually doesn't work. So we would suggest to add back whatever would be needed. You may not add it, you're not building a roadway or a bridge in that specific area, so you may want to go thinner. And we've seen application that can do, you're going to have to clean it. But asphalt, concrete, any of those areas, you already have trails in this area. So we're asking to allow for that parking. It's just a matter of staff cleaning it and being ready for that next event. It's not a matter of if it will, it's when. But again, you're talking about maybe a week out of a year that we are seeing currently.
Well, we had talked about it one time years ago about the type of, there was some kind of grass that drained, and In
You could
this
do grass
particular
pavers.
site.
You can do certain grass pavers, but in certain areas, if you're going to park weekly,
You need,
you've
yeah.
got to have a hard
And I'm not
surface parking.
advocating for that.
Sure.
I'm just trying to make sure that, and I know we are, but make sure that we're going to be cognizant of the fact
And
that
it- and-
putting it in a floodway, we're setting ourselves up for a little bit more maintenance, potentially.
Absolutely.
That's all.
Something to consider, and as you design, to make sure those considerations are taken in it.
Parking in downtown. This proposed amendment arose from a building owner on Main Street who wanted to enclose some space under their rear deck, but they couldn't meet their parking requirement. And the ordinance already provides some relief for parking in downtown, in the downtown district, but it does require parking when new square footage is added. And so we're proposing allowing a small addition in the Main Street area in the downtown district, which is shown in this crimson red color on your screen, that would allow up to 1,000 square feet of new building without requiring additional parking spaces, to allow the owners and the tenants to have a little bit more flexibility or building or breathing room when they use their businesses in downtown, so long as there's no parking that's removed for the addition.
Okay.
Would that mean, so if there was an attic space that was converted into office and it was under 1,000 square feet, no parking, additional parking requirement required? Yes.
Right.
Why 1,000 feet? Just,
It's minor. It was more than what was proposed on the Main Street building, and they ended up going through the variance process and receiving approval for that. So this just avoids a step
Avoids that.
in that
But-
situation.
1,000, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Kelly, what if, maybe I'm missing this. What happens if the next owner wants 1,000 feet?
So it would apply to each individual lot. So each building. But there aren't very many opportunities in the downtown district to really add on. There's a couple theoretical examples on this screen that you see. One's on Main Street and one's on 4th Avenue North that shows what a theoretical 1,000 square foot looks like. But if there's larger scale redevelopment, then the parking requirements are triggered and new parking is required for the entire square footage of the new building.
Well, actually, what I was asking, but that answers part of it. Asking, if the person who's gotten 1,000 feet, they sell, then the next owner of that same building, who's already been given 1,000 feet, what happens then?
That's a good point. There's not a lot of room on those lots because of the building
Okay.
coverage that's there today, but we could certainly look at something to try to
Yeah,
give a 1,000 square foot cap.
one time.
Yeah.
Because you get, they would maximize, I mean, it incentivizes to maximize, fill the entire lot, because there's no parking. I mean, I guess I see what you're saying. That could have some unintended massive, I mean, yeah, 1,000, yeah, I see what you're saying.
But it says no existing parking places are removed. So in other words,
Which
you
that's a
can't
lot of the
build-
open space, that's a lot of the vacant space now, probably on most of these lots, are parking spaces currently.
Right.
That's-
We-
so that's
we
what I'm
would want.
saying. They can't be removed.
Okay, as you all know, short-term vacation rentals are very popular within the city of Franklin. The city zoning ordinance currently does require that for a short-term vacation rental, that the owner is a permanent occupant of the property for at least 21 days a month on average within a 12-month period. What we're proposing is just clarifying that the maximum number of nights that our owner-occupied dwelling may be rented as a short-term vacation rental would be 113 days out of a 12-month period. We get a lot of calls from neighbors, with complaints of the short-term vacation rentals, and it's very hard to track right now. But if we can clarify it with a set number of days, it will make it easier.
How are the number of days gonna make any difference controlling, like, how are you gonna physically check and see if the owner is actually in that home for 21 days or more?
We can't check that the owner is actually there, but we can check when it is rented.
It's impossible. It's.
No, you can tell
it's
when they're
just-
rented, though.
Yeah,
No,
we can tell
not
when they're
always.
rented.
Not always, no. You can't, I'm telling you. Been dealing with this for about 15 years. You just can't always tell.
I think we'd have to look at how the lodging tax piece fits in, because that does track typically to a rate and dates. So there may be an avenue there to help verify that as well.
But it's not Ma'am, it's not parceled out monthly. It can be cumulative as long as, like, say they rented it for 30 days one month and 10 the next. Is that allowable, or does it have to be the breakdown of that?
Well, the way it is written is that the owner is present an average of 21 days per month. So it
Okay.
does average.
Okay.
This, I think, would make a few of you happy. Currently, the City of Franklin's zoning ordinance requires that all new utilities be placed underground. With the advances in high-speed internet and so forth, it's happening more frequently and causing issues. So what the proposed amendment is, would allow providers to complete system upgrades in existing service areas on existing overhead poles, and would only be required to go underground when it's associated with development.
Don't you remember that we had someone who came in and it was right there? I mean, the truck was there, but they couldn't do anything going down the street, so, thank you.
Sorry, I was about to skip one of mine. We're also looking to just clarify for convenience signs for parking areas. We're going to allow them in parking spaces and not further regulate them throughout the zoning ordinance. Accessible spaces would be regulated subject to the building code requirements, because there are specific height requirements for accessible signage. And then spaces within the historic preservation overlay would be subject to historic guidelines.
Can you explain, what do you mean by convenience signs? Because you're saying convenience signs. What's a convenience sign?
Such as the paid parking signs, click list signage, park, to-go orders, park here, that type of.
Oh, so,
It's signage in general that tells the user that's circulating in the site how to get somewhere. So usually they're at the entrances to a development where it might say entrance here, exit here, and they're allowed one per exit, one per entrance. But with the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of new signage popping up in parking lots that are designated parking spaces. So we're trying to address those with this update.
so allow them parking spaces and do not further regulate them. So wait, what are you saying here? To allow them, period, across the board with no regulation, basically?
Well,
I'm trying to get my head around this.
Sure. Right.
I think that's probably not what they're saying.
Well, right now, they're not permitted because they'd classify as a convenience sign. These pick up, order here, So what we're trying to do is just not regulate those that are in parking spaces themselves, because there's a lot of them already out there, and if we tried to establish dimensions for them, we'd just be
Right, it's
creating
too
more
much.
nonconformities.
Yeah.
So we're trying to just allow those to be located in parking spaces and refer to ADA and building codes when they're ADA signs, and then the
Okay.
HPO when it's in downtown and in historic
So if I'm going
districts.
to a restaurant and I have a pickup order, it says pickup orders here, and you go into a parking space.
Correct.
So that's sundry of those things, and we're not looking to regulate those.
No.
Right.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Got it. Perfect.
Good evening. This part on performance agreements is something we've touched upon previously, and it's really a two-pronged approach. As we've discussed, currently we have about $85 million in letters of credits covering a little bit more than 1,100 different types of required improvements on public, most on private property. And there are some of those letters of credits that are around 8 years old, where the majority are under 4 or 5 years. And our concern has been with inflation to ensure that those letter of credits are always going to cover the improvements in the event the developer can't complete those improvements. So the changes here are pretty straightforward, and this is the first step in trying to better manage performance sureties. What we're proposing is to increase the initial value of the letter of credit from 110% of the estimated improvements when a site plan comes in to 125%, and that estimate is based on current cost. Usually a project don't start for 2 or 3 years after that letter of credit perhaps has been posted. The second change we're proposing is to only allow a one-time reduction when at least 75% of that work has been completed. Most developers only request the one-time reduction, but there are several that require more deductions, that require more time and effort and uncertainty of the remaining value of the letters of credit. So when 75% of the work is done, a developer can request that reduction, and then we would reduce the letter of credit to no more than less than 50% of the initial value. The third piece is that we do want to incorporate an inspection fee based on our surveys. Most communities require an inspection fee because it is an intensive effort to look holistically at what the letter of credit is covering. And presently, we make inspections. Many developers call it a punch list, and then those improvements don't get made, and then we're out there the next year doing the same thing. The second part of this relates to how we issue certificates of occupancy. You may remember a few weeks or a few months ago, we talked with Catherine about uses of when certificates of occupancy were required. That's not what we're talking about here. It's about issuing final or temporary COs, and we want to issue a final CO when they've performed. Thus, a performance surety has moved to maintenance, and better manage that as we go forward. And you'll hear more about that piece and that update to the municipal code in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Real quick. So as you explore the surety, I'm just seeing this in the industry that with interest rates going up, and a lot of municipalities have used bonds in the past. Full disclosure, I'm an insurance broker, and so I sell these bonds, but no conflict here. I do think, though, we are going to continue to see folks doing business in the city pinched by if we increase the performance surety. And other municipalities use bonds, allow bonds, and it's a way for I would be curious to see if there are any other municipalities that have a bond program, because as we continue to see interest rates rise, we're going to continue. You all are going to be getting more phone calls from folks doing business in the city because they're paying the interest carry on that letter of credit for a length of time. So, just evaluating. It may not be bond. There may be some other creative way out there that other cities are doing to pair bonds with surety with letters of credit. on larger projects, but I think, and just for the ones that have an improvement that they're going to have to do, not for fees. Because I just think the interest rates are not coming down, and it's a significant carrying cost, and I think y'all going to continue to see calls on that. So best practices from other cities, and we can talk offline on that. Thank you.
I know we're at time, but I can get through these next 4 slides in a minute.
Perfect.
Okay, all right. Zoning map, we hit all the text amendments. And now we're on to the zoning map. There are several properties on Natchez Street. Dr. Hill with Shorter Chapel AME Church reached out to staff late last year after the Merrill Williams House rezoning for the civic, institutional, and the historic preservation overlay districts. And so the first several slides are about those. There are a couple historic buildings, the Shorter Chapel itself, which was constructed in 1925 and listed on the National Register. The Bezelia S. Harris Community Life Center, which is part of Shorter Chapel, which is a community welcome center, and Franklin's Green Book House, which is adjacent to Shorter Chapel. So these are proposed rezonings to CI and HPO to better align with the use of the properties. And then the scenic
I have
corridor.
a question on that
yes.
first. So I pulled Envision Franklin and looked up their tax cards, their current registration, zoning, everything on that. Great ringer somebody's got, I love it. On the Harris House, I'm reading it here, and it says, hosts receptions, business meeting, workshops, special events, banquets, and serves food for families and after-school programs. But when I look at the downtown entirety, this is very reminiscent of the Franklin Grove that we just visited a while back that had the exact same zoning, and there was not an event venue allowed under that zoning, but yet here it's going to be okay. But even though I know this is for compact residential, it's still the same historic overlay, so I'm confused. Can you explain that to me, please?
I can't really address Franklin Grove because I've stepped away from that particular project, but I can speak to the Natchez Street property, that this is part of the church operation, and I've worked with Tom Marsh, the Building and Neighborhood Services Director, to qualify this as a place of public assembly as part of the church use.
But if they want to hold events, then that would be okay under CI, and they don't need a PUD?
I've been to some things there.
If it is an event that is related to the use, such as churches have events all the time that are ancillary to that use. So if it's ancillary to what the primary use is, it would be
But their actual use
allowed.
right now, I can go online, I looked it up, I can rent it as the public for an event if I want to have one.
Yeah, I looked this up too. I was curious.
If I may. Let us come back in the time and address that, because what I'm hearing here is, I wonder if that use was permitted, and, that kind of goes back to what I brought up about certificates of use and occupancy, because
disconnect.
understandably, people expand uses on their property. But let us come back to that so we can move to City Hall, since we have some guests with us.
Well, I would just reiterate that too, because I brought questions with that, because CI already exists. Help me understand that, why the area is different than the other downtown areas. If it's already built, but an event is a new use under the zoning ordinance, technically, they want you to rezone it to PD. So when you come back, how is this considered? I mean, should we not consider, Franklin Grove is a great example, because, no event space was allowed, but events like weddings, they didn't want weddings there, they didn't want these things. Workshops, they didn't want workshops there. And so I'm really confused with this as well. I had a ton of questions, and I wish we had time to spend on this. So can you all come back? And then maybe I can send, maybe Gabrielle or anybody else has questions, we can send them to you to clarify? Okay, great. Thanks. Yep, thank you.
Lastly, the Scenic Corridor Overlay District. There's some minor line work corrections that we want to do that are along the edges of the Scenic Corridor Overlay District. It has to do with a newer tracing tool that we have that can very accurately just trace the right-of-way line for how they create the buffer that creates the SCO, which is just more accurate than the old way that used to be done. So that's just an update that doesn't really change the distances, just some corrections where you see like the red lines. And
Okay.
this is one of the more prominent
Can you let us
places.
know that as well? Because I'd like to know where is, I mean, I've got a map with no designation of streets or anything on it. So where does that affect? Because I remember one time it was brought up about scenic overlay over there in front of West Haven by the veterinarian's place, and there were some issues there, and we did not vote for that. I'd like to know where this is located exactly, and what streets, and how far in and why, that kind of thing. So can you give us some more information on that?
Thank you. I will say, it appears that since it does have a subtitle there where it says MacAtcher Parkway, it's actually going northwest on approaching Cool Springs, the Cool Springs Boulevard intersection on this map. So, but we would need the cross streets and everything.
And this is the largest area. This is why I chose to put it, because you have to get really close to see the differences. And this particular area that's shown in red is actually right-of-way that we're removing from the SCO.
So the timeline, so the board will know where we're going very quickly before we go on.
Very lastly, thank you. The 3 properties on Natchez Street will go to the Historic Zoning Commission for nomination September 12th, then on to Planning Commission September 22nd, and then going to the October 25th work session and first reading due to staffing with fall break calendars for Williamson County and Franklin Special School Districts. And then November 22nd for the second reading and public hearing, BOMA for the third and final reading on December 13th with an anticipated effective date of January 1, 2023.
So we've got plenty of time to have those discussions and continue to hash that out, and we'll move forward if that's okay with everybody. So we'll go to City Hall Development Project Update and discussion of scenarios.
We're bringing some folks up here. I'll get us started as we're
Okay, good.
bringing folks up. This is an important discussion, an important next step in this project. This project really is the home to our City Hall operations. It's our headquarters. It has an important impact. Redeveloping City Hall will shape how we serve. It'll create a vital community gathering place and enhance our beautiful downtown square. So we're going to walk through for you tonight the impact of 3 broad scenarios that reflect the options that we've talked about over the past year, a little less than a year. And what we've tried to do is bring various aspects and expertise to bear on this. In July, you heard from Bob Gibbs, who's a renowned expert related to retail and market and commercial space and how it works in a downtown and works in different areas. And so we heard from him in July, and we've incorporated his information in what we're talking about today. But we also are bringing our expertise related to the legal structure and the financial structure that will help us deliver the project and deliver whatever options we ultimately select for this project. Let me make a couple introductions. Some of you know these folks, some of you don't. Let me introduce first our bond counsel, Lillian Blackshear. Lillian's with Bass Berry. They've been our longtime bond counsel, serve communities and entities across our state, bring a lot of expertise both in terms of Tennessee law, but just overall structure in terms of how we do debt and different other financial instruments that we implement to help us do our work. And Christine works very closely with her, as does Shauna, and so they'll be chiming in as well. Also have Lauren Lowe with us. Lauren is from PFM. They're our financial advisor. They're a neutral third party that gives us advice on financial transactions and strategies. PFM works across the country with a lot of different governments to deliver projects and to look at alternatives. They are truly a neutral third party when they look at these. They don't benefit by underwriting or working with any of the instruments we might use. They just give us advice and help bring their expertise to bear. So you will hear from both Lauren and Lillian as we go through this, along with our staff team. So let's walk through what we're going to show you tonight. We're going to give you sort of a update or a review of where we've been, the steps that have happened in this project. We'll talk specifically around legal and financial considerations that impact primarily the option 3A and 3B that deal with integrating commercial uses with the public use. There's some very specific elements of that, so we will talk about that specifically. We will walk through each of these options. Scenario 1, which is a smaller initial building footprint with a full garage. That has been further developed, and we'll talk through that with you. The initial master plan that came through our first phase of this project, we'll talk through that, how that could be delivered. And then finally, options 3A and 3B, which are dealing with the integration of commercial space into the project. And why there's an A and a B deals with the assumptions you make about the cost to deliver those projects. So it kind of gives you a range of what that might cost us and give you a sense of what that would look like. Then I'll provide you a recommendation based on what we know at this point and talk about where the project and process may go from there, and then we'll be glad to entertain dialogue and discussion there. I'm going to probably have a couple stopping points along the way, like legal and financial. When we walk through that, we'll stop and ask some questions, make sure everybody's on the same page there. Do the same thing probably with each scenario just to make sure we're clear on that. And then, at the end, then it goes where you want to go in terms of discussion and dialogue. So let's move on.
Could you clarify that one thing for me? It says partial building, full garage, full master build, partial building, that 3A, 3B. When you say partial building, full garage, and mixed use, partial building, does that mean the building would still be totally built out, but only partial, but it wouldn't be built out internally?
So option
Or
one.
externally?
Option 1 is kind of the revised smaller building footprint. And so that's been adjusted some, so that's option 1.
Yeah.
Option 3 is really option 1, adding on commercial space in addition to it. Okay, so
Okay.
you end up with a larger total footprint, but your city operations component is really the same as option 1, and then you've added 38,000 square feet
So it's a
of
partial
commercial
build.
space to
Okay.
it.
Okay, got it.
And
All right.
then to
That's
complete
what-
that, scenario 2 is the master plan, which was, I think, around 115,000 square feet. So that'll be in each of the scenarios as we talk
Got
through
it,
that.
thanks.
No problem. All right, so let's walk through where we've been. This is a project that started in 2020 when the board approved phase 1, which is the development of a master plan. That process took the better part of a year and a half as we went through 20 and 21. We had public engagement, various meetings, and of course that was in the midst of the pandemic, so a lot of that was virtual, but we had, I think, somewhere in the range of 600, 700 citizens participate in that and give us input, along with different elements where we engaged the board, different times too where we've engaged staff and key folks from every department have been represented all along the way to give their input as we look at the project. From that, we delivered a master plan that was approved at the end of 21, And you may remember action you took earlier this year to authorize us to move into Phase 2 with some staging. And Phase 2 is schematic design. We added to that an initial work with evaluating the use of commercial space, and that's where we brought Mr. Gibbs, the Gibbs Design Group, in to give us some input on that and evaluate what that would look like. We also, though, in this worked up what that reduced footprint might work, how that might work with our staff team. So that is also part of this discussion, and those two elements are part of what we'll talk about tonight. And what we told you at that point is we would provide all that information, then give you the chance to work through that and give us guidance on what we do in schematic design. So let's go on to the next one. This reprogramming piece talks about exactly that. You know, we took the footprint that was in the 115,000 square foot master plan component, looked at that. We had to downsize that to fit our financial model. So that's where that option, what's referred to in this presentation as option 1, came from. And so we also did that with preserving about $20 million of capital investment capacity as well, so that we could continue to look at additional projects, also provide for costs that might be impacted by inflation in existing approved projects, et cetera. So that was part of that framework in developing that option. So in that, we've worked closely with our team to evaluate what that smaller building would look like, and now we're at about a 91,000 square foot building in the smaller building footprint. That's about an $84 million cost. So we have additional cost to that, but we also have additional cash that has entered the project because we completed a fiscal year. We have additional capacity that went under our reserves. You have a policy that allows us to use cash above a certain level to go into capital projects. So we targeted a conservative amount of that, and that's in the last page of your big printout that shows you how we got there. That adds some capacity, reduces the amount we might have to borrow, and just helps leverage that project. Again, that's just from the last completed fiscal year. So we will have opportunity to grow that. All right, let's go on to our next. And this next slide just gives you an overview of what those scenarios look like. Scenarios 1 and 2, quite frankly, from a legal and financial standpoint, are pretty straightforward. It's what we do all the time when we deliver projects, and they involve the issue of GO debt. So yeah, that's really not much different than what you typically see. What Christine would have described to you if we had done item 3, but that's pretty straightforward and something we do on a pretty regular basis. Scenarios 3A and 3B is where it gets different. It is more complex. We're layering in a commercial use, therefore involvement of the Industrial Development Board and taxable debt along with our usual tax exempt debt. So it has a complexity to it, and we want to walk through what that looks like, and we'll kind of do that up front so that you know kind of the homework we've done to show if we did it, how we would do it, and then when we get into the scenarios, we'll evaluate a little more its impact on our financial capacity and other key considerations. Let's go on to the next slide. I think this is where Lauren's going to jump in and talk a little more about this.
Sure. Good evening. So I'm going to provide just a very high-level overview of some of the structures related to the scenarios you're going to see that the city continue to walk through and explain. So as Eric mentioned, the city tax-exempt GO debt, that is a traditional use for how the city would borrow for any of its capital projects for public use. It's a traditional city process where this Board of Mayor and Aldermen will consider the issuance of additional debt and go through the approval process. That approval process does remain with the city, and there's no other parties that would come into that process. We also expect that the city's credit rating would be part of that process. So as a reminder, the city has 2 credit ratings. Both are AAA, so the highest credit rating available to the public finance sector, which correlates to the lowest possible cost when borrowing in the tax-exempt market. To further that lower cost, it's also that public use projects will get the benefit of tax-exempt interest rates. Conversely, looking at the other options that we're considering tonight is the Industrial Development Board as an issuer, as a portion of one of these scenarios. So the distinction is if you have the Industrial Development Board involved, that is another body that will have to go through an approval process, and they'll have various governing documents that will have to be considered for their approval. It also, we expect additional documentation to be between the city and this, what we refer to as a conduit issuer or the Industrial Development Board. We don't know what the IDB credit rating would be, but I am very confident in telling you today that it will not be what the city's credit rating is, just because you've sort of set the bar pretty high. So we have to just be mindful of, you know, a lower credit rating will obviously result in a higher interest rate. And obviously, we've heard even earlier in discussions that we're sort of in a very influx interest rate environment in the moment. Also, any commercial use or private use, as referred to by my colleague Lillian, will result in the need to issue on a taxable interest rate. So also that will play into the assumptions and the part of the scenarios you see that we factored in all of these considerations. So with that, I will turn it over to Lillian to talk through the legal structure of the scenarios.
Sure, thanks for that, Lauren. So we'll talk about what a traditional financing structure would look like, and then we'll go to what a structure would look like to do a long-term private use project. So the typical structure, when I say typical, I mean like 99.9% of the time, what a city would do would be to issue tax-exempt GO bonds. And so that would be a public project, like example, City Hall, any type of municipal facility. It would be minimal private use. You would have then typically your GO pledge behind it. So your GO pledge is going to be your general obligation, full faith and credit, property taxing pledge. That is allowable under state law, both statutorily, and then it's allowable under the Tennessee Constitution. So there's a clause in the Tennessee Constitution, Article 2, Section 29, that we Tennessee bond lawyers live by, that's referred to as the lending of credit clause. So what that clause says essentially is that local governments cannot lend their quote-unquote credit to private entities without a referendum. So you could, as a city, pledge your full faith and credit to a private project, but that would require a referendum of the local government, and then also it would require an assent of 3/4 of the votes cast. So it's a pretty high bar, obviously. So what generally cities, counties try to do is just avoid lending of credit altogether. But if you are a city that's issuing a public project, then obviously that's not going to be invoking the lending of credit clause, and you'd be fine to pledge your full faith and credit behind that project. Because in these types of typical projects, you would have minimal private use, you will be able to meet the federal tax rules that require minimal private use in order to be able to issue on a tax-exempt basis. So in your typical financing structure, you have a GO pledge and a tax-exempt interest rate. If a city wanted to do a long-term privately used project, so something that's obviously under consideration right now, we would not be able to do the GO pledge because of the Tennessee constitutional limitations without a referendum. So it could be done, but it'd be a pretty high bar to be able to do it. Because there would be widespread private use, the federal tax rules would not allow there to be federal tax exemption on these bonds. So obviously that would be a bit of a higher rate. State law does, however, permit the issuance of debt to finance privately used projects under the Industrial Development Board financing scheme. So what that would be is the Industrial Development Board, not the city proper rate, but the IDB being the issuer of this debt. And then you would use typically the project revenues as security of the debt. If, however, there was some deficiency between the debt service on the bonds and the project revenues that are coming in, obviously some entity would need to be introduced to make up that shortfall. And so what happens often is that the local government would offer financial support of the project. Because of the Tennessee constitutional limitations, you could not pledge your property tax dollars to the payment of this debt. However, state law allows what is referred to, obviously you guys know about it very well, an appropriation of dollars. So not a pledge of dollars, but an appropriation of dollars to the payment of this debt. The way that pledges and appropriations are considered under state law are very distinct. I know Lauren can talk about ad nauseum how they're viewed by the market, how they're viewed by investors, but under state law, they're viewed as very distinct creatures. So an appropriation is not considered debt of the city. A pledge would be considered debt of the city. An appropriation would not be considered debt of the city. So an appropriation should not invoke that lending of credit clause. However, to be conservative and also, quite frankly, to model IDB financings on which I've worked and I'm currently working, what we would suggest would be to not only avoid the support of property tax dollars via a pledge, but also avoid the support of property tax dollars via the appropriation. So what the city would do at that point, they would have the shortfall, whatever it would be, like $5 million, for example. There might be a shortfall in the debt service between the financing and what the project revenues are. And so you would point to available monies of the city to pay that deficiency. A conservative, and again, completely modeled after deals that I'm working on, way to handle that would be, we're going to point to available dollars of the city to pay that shortfall, but we're going to point to non-property tax dollars of the city to pay that shortfall. And so that,
Can our reserves pay that?
for, where do you want to go?
So notwithstanding the legal
Can
question.
the reserves pay the shortfall?
I'll let her address the legal issue. I will tell you that there will be a concern from a pure credit standpoint because you're using non-reoccurring dollars
Yeah.
to pay a reoccurring or potential reoccurring cost. If we only knew it to be like a one-time hit that wouldn't be forthcoming down the road, I don't think the city's credit would sort of take a hit. But if we can't certify that this is just an anomaly, COVID, for example, then it potentially puts pressure on the city's credit rating. Now, that doesn't answer your legal question. I just want to make that distinction of sort of the credit reference that would come into the conversation.
Right. Thank you.
But, I mean, yes, from a legal perspective, any unrestricted dollars could be used to support the debt. So that's the legal structure in a nutshell, and I know that, Eric, I think you wanted to allow some questions to be asked at that point, so.
Can I take a second? Please. And just so we're clear, and we have all of this, like on the floor talking to you guys about it tonight, we have not talked to anyone with the IDB about this. So, this is something that we would have to approach with them. They're not a very active board, so we would have to, get with them, talk with them, and then, they don't have staff. So we would have to kind of think about how that would work internally with us and with them.
One of the things you'll see when we get into the scenarios 3A and 3B, we've built some costs into that because you are going to have to staff it. It's not a small cost because there's some significant obligations there. So it will be different than what we do now just because it's got some complexity to it. So you're going to have to pay for some operations of that entity that will own that portion of the building, to be clear.
So why does the private entity have to own it?
So it wouldn't be a private entity, it would be the IDB, so it would be a public instrumentality. But you want the IDB to be introduced into the chain of title because that's what's keeping this project as distinct from a city proper project. You don't want this to be a city proper project. You don't want it to look like it or feel like it because then you start to wade into the waters of the lending of credit clause. So you want the IDB to be introduced into the chain of title. And, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. To the extent that you wanted the city to be involved in the project, you could have the IDB designate the city as its agent. I mean, the IDB doesn't have to be the entity that is hands-on day-to-day. I know that's going to be putting additional pressure on city finance if the IDB were to designate the city as its agent. But, I mean, the city could enter into an agreement with the IDB to be as involved as it would like to be in the project.
How similar is this to Nissan? To the TIF district for Nissan?
What did we do that?
It would be a different type of
It's
credit.
not.
It utilized the structure of an IDB, but it did not have the annual debt obligations
obligation.
associated.
Right. Yeah.
Essentially,
Didn't
what
have
we
it all.
did in Nissan is we fronted some money
Yep.
to bridge that gap
Yeah.
before the TIF increments started to flow. And then now we're starting to, we're paying
it back.
ourselves back. This is an obligation every year based on the IDB's obligation to the bondholder, to their bondholders.
To the bondholder.
So it is a more in-depth relationship, I would say.
Well, and there was a distinction that the city limited its liability on the TIF loan to $5 million.
Yeah.
And
With a cap.
certainly, that was a cap,
Yeah,
yes,
we had a
ma'am.
cap.
And so that limited the city's liability, and then when we paid off the debt, we're now kind of in the unwinding of the TIF, because the debt's gone, but it was about $2.4 million that the city up fronted, but there was a cap, and then at that point was when the TIF district was able to pay its own debt service.
One of the things related to that, a cap is an option here too.
Yeah.
But the reality is, your name's associated with it. So you can have a cap, but if you start to push it and go beyond it, we would have a very serious conversation of, do we need to step in further and fill this void? Because, it may be the IDB's debt, but it is associated with the city of Franklin and our AAA credit. And so you might have a cap,
Yeah,
but you
you might.
might not really have a cap, because if the rubber met the road on that,
Yeah, you-
you'd probably feel like you'd need to do something for the greater good of our financial standing and our ability to deliver other projects down the
Yeah.
line and to issue debt and function the way we function
Well,
now.
the chain of title, does that always permanently stay with them? Doesn't that eventually roll off?
Right. So the reason that you would want to have the IDB introduced is because there's this lending of credit problem
Yeah.
because of the private use. But if the city were in a position where it wanted to take over this space, I mean, absolutely, you can enter into an agreement with the IDB where the IDB says, we will sell this property, we will convey this property to you by donation. So it doesn't have to stay with the IDB, but as long as the lending of credit concern is out there because of the private use, you would want that to be a distinct project from the city proper.
So Lillian, to clarify that,
Yeah.
is that both the ownership, like the ownership of the use?
Yeah.
Not just the existing debt? So say the debt had been
Yeah.
paid off, but it was still a commercial use, we'd still need to work through the IDB, is that true?
No, if
Don't
there
you?
was no debt, then there's no credit, I guess, outstanding.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's,
Oh.
what
Yes,
if we
that's
still
gone.
owed the city back for money that had been advanced to pay debt service in prior years? The debt itself was retired, but the IDB still owed the city. Would that clear that hurdle or not?
Yeah, I think that should be fine. And I'll make this point, even if the debt is still outstanding, but the use has now been transitioned to a city hall use, then
that
there's no
wipes it
need
off.
for the
Yeah,
IDB,
right,
yeah.
that goes away.
Right.
So does that mean your break even of 32 years would not be accurate? Later on, you
That's accurate from a break even. It's whether the ownership could transition.
Understood, okay, the
Yeah,
ownership.
yeah, that's the way to think of it.
It's not
So-
about the debt.
I had a question, but if someone else.
I
Yeah.
think I've got you, Alderman Baggett, then I've got Alderman Peterson. Okay.
So I just kind of want to step back. We were told that we needed 115,000 square feet for the next 40 year, or to what, 2040 years?
20 years out.
20 years
Yeah.
out. We were told we needed 100, our 1-year master plan was that we need 115,000 square feet to meet the needs of the city hall, of city employees for future use. We were then given an option for 75,000 square feet-ish.
About 80,000.
80,000, 78, something like that, 80,000. That was the first option one. This all started because we said, well, what if we build the whole thing, and then lease out the remaining space, sublease the remaining space out? Then we started talking about retail and commercialization, it broadened. So we know it needs to be a city, obviously it needs to be a city hall. What if we build this at 115,000 square feet, COVID happens like it did, and people work from home and we have this open space, and we decided to sublease that out on are we legally prohibited from subleasing office space that we have debt on? Not that does that make sense?
Yeah, and when you say debt, you have to think about how the debt is secured, right?
If we issued a GO bond, we built it at 115,000 square feet, is all office use, bottom falls out, and we have 30,000 square feet of open space, and we wanted to just sublease it, but we had a GO debt on it, is that illegal?
So you would want to, so there's two considerations. So there's the lending of credit clause under the Tennessee Constitution, and then there's also federal tax rules, right? So you would want to pay attention to both. So from a Tennessee constitutional perspective, you want to avoid long-term private use of geo-backed projects. And
Got it.
so what we are often thinking of as long-term private use is kind of 10 years or more, because at that point, you're transitioning from a public use to a private use. But also, there are federal tax rules. So if you've issued the debt on a tax-exempt basis, you would want to make sure you stay below certain thresholds of private use. And so that's both private use and private payments. And if you're talking about a use of the project that's unrelated or disproportionately unrelated to the actual public purpose of the project, then it's a 5% threshold. So you have your private use, you would want to stay below 5%, and then you would want the private payments coming in to be less than 5% of the debt service that's owed on the bond. And so there could be ways to structure a situation like that where you don't go above the threshold. It wouldn't be a moneymaker, obviously, right? Because, yeah,
Because the reason, because we've got, this is not legal nor financial, but we're also looking at 20 years of construction inflation. And so those are some economic costs to us deciding to build a smaller one now instead of a larger one later, or large one now and not having those construction costs down the road. So thank you, that's all.
Alderman Peterson.
Well, I'm thinking back in time what was done before, and I really don't remember a lot of it, but Clyde and I were just saying, whenever the city purchased this building, they had a referendum on whether they bought it or not, you know, so, I mean, you know, the public required it, actually. But the other thing is that whenever it was first purchased by the city, there were other entities that rented out things, you know, in here. But my really big question is, I can remember many, many, many years ago when the IDB was a big player for the city. I don't remember what projects they.
Proton Center.
Oh, okay, see, there's an example of one thing, but I mean.
Their business model is what paid for the debt on those bonds. And we had no financial responsibility for those.
We were just the conduit.
Well, wait,
We were
excuse
more
me,
of a conduit.
could I go on, please?
I was just saying, it's a conduit.
Well, there were a lot of other projects that they were involved with, many, before I ever became an alderman. And I want to know kind of what that background was, because I very well remember going to some of their meetings, and I was really impressed by how that board was quite impressive, I'll have to say. But I'm just talking about, there were a lot of things over many years that they had something to do with, and I want to find out what, you know, kind of the not just the history, but I mean how they handle the things and everything. But I think that is extremely important to us under this circumstance.
Thank you, Alderman Peterson.
Mayor,
Go ahead,
could you
Alderman Barker.
do one more time the referendum? And let's just say 10,000 people vote in the referendum. 7,500 of them would have to vote to approve the referendum?
If you wanted to pledge your general obligation, full faith and credit, property taxing power to a privately used project, a long-term privately used project, then that would invoke the lending of credit clause, which says that you can't do that unless you have a referendum right where it's a vote of the city, and you would require 3/4 of the votes to be in favor of the pledge of the property taxing power.
So can I, because you know, this is like dashboards and budget and finance, and I'm like swimming, trying to figure out how to breathe. But I said to the boys, an analogy would be like Metro Nashville and the Titan Stadium. How they would partner with them on a big project like that, but Metro doesn't own it. Is that a good analogy or no?
Well, I think anytime you look at private use and public instrumentalities is helpful, it would be done under a different statute. There's a sports authority there, and so it's different statutory authority, but it's the same
There's some
concept.
parallel, though.
Yeah, it's the same concept.
Substitute IDB for Sports Authority.
Right, yeah. It's the same concept that you're introducing an instrumentality instead of having Metro proper be on the hook for that debt.
And again, there would be
Right.
revenues that were generated by the stadium and taxes that they would put on all
Right.
the tickets that would support paying the bonds.
Right,
But
that's
at the end of the
exactly.
day, the city is filling the gap.
And
Yeah, just
that's
like this-
exactly
I've
right.
been through that.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it's a different statutory authority, so I don't want to get into the weeds of the revenues that are used, but they're different, right, they're different revenues that are used to pay that debt. And then backstopping a lot of those sports authority bonds would be a pledge of non-property tax revenues.
Yeah. Isn't that the way they handled the soccer? Yeah,
Right, and
That was
First Horizon
exactly-
Park,
yeah.
right, yeah.
that's how they layered.
Good comment. Other questions before we continue on?
So let's talk through the scenarios. Before I jump into the details of this, one of the things that really importantly came out of the master planning process is that we want this building to better serve the citizens in the community. We want to better support our employee team and the important work they do in providing services to the citizens, better complement our historic downtown, and reflect those high standards and expectations, balance security in a welcoming environment, and then ultimately meet the future programmatic needs. Not just what we do, but how we do it, both in terms of the space needed, but also flexibility in how we do it. And so that's kind of running through all this. We want to make sure we're checking those boxes in any scenario we look at. And so let's walk through these three plus scenarios. All of them have certain components in them consistently. We tried to give you sort of an assessment of risk factor overall. You'll see that sort of as a evaluation. That's our judgment on how that fits and what the city is taking on. Each of these includes a 20-year level annual payment approach, which is consistent with what we do now in managing capital investment projects. So that is consistent across the scenarios. The minimum City Hall assumes the $91,000. That's up from the original just under $80,000, I think it was in February. That's a reflection of a couple things. We've been able to delve more into discussions with departments about what they need and how they can work in a smaller footprint. So we got a little creative with some of that and how departments can work. We also have the realistic perspective of what's buildable. So there's just some natural elements that enabled us to push out that square footage a little bit. And so that helps us meet those needs in a smaller footprint, larger than what we talked about in February, but smaller than the original master plan, but that meets the programmatic needs identified in the master plan. So we talk about construction costs. We've got the office component standardized at about $921 as an all-in cost per square foot. The commercial has a range on it. That's why we did a 3A and a 3B, because Mr. Gibbs made some assumptions, but we've also got some base assumptions in the building, and so we wanted to kind of give you that as a range and as a bracket. And then we look at the scenarios in 3A and 3B and try to build off of the assumptions as best we could that Mr. Gibbs provided you, again, to use his expertise from a market capacity standpoint and that assessment, along with assessing the legal and financial parameters. So let's go to option one. This is the smaller building footprint. I explained to you how it moved from 80,000 up to 91,000, but it meets the programmatic needs designed or identified in the master plan. I call this a master plan with a budget, because we did the master plan kind of just based on what do we need, what are our best projection of 20-year staffing and those kind of things. And then we folded in what's our capital investment capacity look like, and that's when we started looking at how to adjust it. But, you know, we feel really like we've made great progress in how this can work and function really well. Something you'll be able to see later, we'll talk about that in next steps, but we've done what's called these test fits that look at how departments work and fit together on each of the 3 floors, and that's what translates into this 91,000 square foot building. And that's something staff just has started to look at in the last week. We want to present that to you after we've refined it with staff input later in the fall. So you'll get to see how that works and get a sense of how viable that is as its own building. And how this does meet that projection out and does preserve $20 million of capacity for other projects and inflation on other capital investments. So this allows you to deliver a city hall at the projected future staffing needs and preserves capacity. Michael will walk through some specifics on how those numbers fit, and we'll stop at the end of this and take any questions you have on this scenario.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the board. Michael Walters-Young, your Budget and Strategic Innovation Manager. As Eric indicated, this is sort of the base scenario that all of these other scenarios go on in terms of City Hall. Okay, so if you go to 3A and 3B, which we'll go to in a few minutes, the numbers are exactly the same for the municipal office component because they're right here in scenario 1. It is a 91,250 square foot building plate. The estimated construction cost is $84 million. That would be financed through $69 million of general obligation tax exempt debt and $15 million of cash. Eric has indicated and kind of walked you through initially where that additional cash comes from, but in your packets, it is page 11, and you can see where that calculation comes from. I will take this moment also to say you have 2 sets of paper in front of you. You have your PowerPoint, and then you have the actual blown up numbers, because I fully admit we did the best we could, but 3A and 3B are really small, and we felt you needed to have it in hand so you could zoom in as best you could. Pages 3 and 4 are really page 3 is scenario 1 of which I'm speaking of. The assumption is that we will issue this, like I said, tax exempt, backed up by our government, our general obligation pledge for 20 years with our AAA bond rating. We are using an estimate of 4.5%. Don't ask if we're going to issue at 4.5%. When we actually issue these bonds, we'll let you know where the rates are in the market, but we felt this was a prudently appropriate measure, both in terms of our cost and in terms of what we could borrow today, because we know today. The cost per square foot, as Eric said, is $921. The financing cost is then $1,113 for a total cost of $101 million when you add in your cumulative interest charges. Level annual payments, we believe that this is a low risk to the city. You do not have to raise any additional sources of revenue to afford it. It fits within your financial model, and it is 100% city controlled.
One of the things I should have mentioned when I was setting up the different scenarios, they all assume the full build out of the garage. You may remember when we talked in February, it just cost effectively, while you're building the garage, do the whole thing. And then even if you don't build out the full footprint, it provides a platform for green space on the Church Street end of this site, if that's where you go. So that is incorporated, and that was your guidance there, and that's consistent throughout all this. Michael did highlight the 2 things that are different than February is the cash used moved from $7 million to $15 million, okay? And that's because of how we closed out the fiscal year, and we think that's conservative. You still have 2 more years before you would be issuing this debt. So you might be able to add cash to this to make it even better in terms of how this plays out. But this is a baseline, conservative baseline that we think we could deliver the project on. I'll stop there and take any questions you have about this scenario.
Go ahead, Alderman.
So the money we're putting down, is it not the cost to pay the interest over a longer period of time, maybe more in our benefit in holding our money ourselves, or is it that we can't get the loan product without X number of dollars down?
You could do more different structures and more, stretch it out, et cetera. We have taken the approach of using 20 years as a good baseline and how we share that cost with current and future residents. It's kind of a policy choice, but we think from a conservative planning standpoint, having level annual payments over 20 years is a good way to plan it. if you look at the way our debt used to be structured, we had this mountain that we had in one year and then dips and ups and downs, and we want to stabilize that to help us deliver other projects and also serve operations. Because when we pay debt service, we pay it first with property tax, and then what's left in property tax goes to support operations. So if that's up and down and all around, it affects our ability to deliver base services over the long haul. So Christine may want to weigh in on that too.
Something else I'll just give a commentary to is certainly our investments of city funds. We do have limitations on how far out we can invest, and that's in state law in Tennessee. So we typically invest 2 years. We are allowed to go up to 4-year investments. So we're not, because the state wants us to be liquid in our investments and then of course be safe. And then certainly, yields are a third consideration, but we're not investing our reserves in long-term instruments. We are in very safe 2 to 4, most of it's 2 to 4 year instruments, and then of course we keep our liquidity for paying our bills and cash on hand.
And we do need to say that we have also kind of a rule that we're going to keep X amount of money in reserve. Period.
A reserve fund
Correct.
policy.
That reserve fund policy.
And that's highlighted on page 11 to break out the buckets, if you will, that your policy says that anything over 45% of the general fund would be free and clear to spend on capital projects. So below it, you have that supplemental reserve of 33 to 45, and then all your other planned reserves for any other contingency is that minimum fund balance of 33% of the current year's general fund revenues.
I thought when we set that up, that it was 33%, or whatever the percentage was, of the daily operations
It's of an annual operating budget.
budget.
Yeah.
So the annual operating budget now is 90 million,
95.
95 million. So the percentage is 33%, 34, 35?
So the percentage remains the same. So the percentage is a
Percentage
minimum of
remains the
33.
same.
The dollar amount is
It
between
goes
31
up.
and 32 million at this point.
Okay. So if the board opted to do 2 or 3 things, if the board opted to raise that percentage, that would lower the amount of funds available. The second thing is, I think it's interesting that we go through all of this and say, what a grand and glorious time we're having right now. When 2 years ago, we were wringing our hands and we were just lost as to what we're gonna do for a few months. And I don't know if that's gonna happen again, but I don't think that it's gonna be just this utopian 20-year whatever project or whatever we've got going here without some ups and downs on that. So when I hear that we're spending an additional $9 million out of reserves, I'm a little bit concerned about that. And I'm concerned, if in 6 months, we've added 11,250 square feet to the building, which we had 80,000 square feet in February. It's now 91,250. I don't understand how we could go back to a department head and it suddenly reevaluated what we needed for the space here. We went through that. That's a 2-year-old drill. 2 years ago when we went through and determined the amount of space that we thought we needed, and we were looking at 117,000 square feet. We dropped it down to 80 because that's what we could afford at the time based upon the projected revenue that we saw coming in. We're now at 91,250, 84 million total cost, finance charges run it up to 101 million. I have to be quite candid with you. I need to understand that just a little bit better, and that's on me. I will do that. But that's not exactly where I expected us to be in 2019 when, and I understand that was just a place card and a holding place, but we had 32 billion for City Hall. 24 million of that was for the building, 8 billion of it was for the garage. And now we're up to 184 million, 101 million, depending on which scenario you look at. So those things right there are not necessarily where I am comfortable with is what we're doing. And I've made no secret about the fact that the city hall is needed. I mean, we bought this building probably, late 70s?
40 years ago, yeah, 40 plus, yeah.
And I have no problems with the building itself. I do have some, though, even with the design, is this a two-story building or three?
It's a three-story building.
Three-story. Because I was going to say, if it's two, and at one time we looked at two, did we not? Sometime or other?
In the master planning process, we looked at a two
Two.
and a three option,
Okay.
2 and 3 floor option. The third floor is a smaller step back, a little bit from the, it's not as large a footprint on the third floor for sure.
But we're on an 80,000 square foot footprint right now. That's what this building is.
You're on one floor, yeah,
One floor.
roughly.
Okay. So and I'm not, this is just for general discussion and general thinking and whatever else we need to do on this. But I can tell you, that 101 million and that 84 million and all of that, that ain't gonna happen. Because it will be more. If we continue at 9.5% inflation, by the time we get this thing, and I used, and this is not a fair comparison. Franklin Road, we can't get built. Gift Street, we can't get finished. We have difficulty now with supplies. We have difficulty now with people working, and they're going to run into the same thing. And that's not going to build out suddenly and all of us jump into a new office building in 2026, 2028, whenever we're looking at. So I'll be looking at it from that end, and I've mentioned my other concerns to you and to anyone else that wanted to listen. I'm probably not going to cover those tonight, but that's enough from me for right now.
Go ahead, Alderman Baggett.
A few questions. The $921 a square foot, help me remind me, and I sent you this ahead of time, so it wasn't a surprise, but remind us what is in that 921.
That walks through both the construction costs based on constructability that came from the design team, and it does anticipate inflation out to when we would be bidding and starting the construction of the project.
Does it include furniture, fixtures, and equipment
Yes.
in there? Okay.
It's an
So
all-in cost.
it's all in cost. I think it would be helpful for me. It does make a difference to kind of see that separate. I think when we're talking about building a building
Yeah.
and the stuff that we're going to have to pay for anyway, if you, let's just say hypothetically, we were to renovate this building, which we know is not on in the cards, but we wanted to put all brand new furniture in here.
Yeah, how much would we be spending?
Like, it's
regardless?
just stuff that you're going to have to pay for anyway, right? I mean, I think that's really important to break that out because that's in this number, and it's probably a pretty big number for this size building. So I think seeing that would make this a little bit more palatable. I share Alderman Barnhill's concern with I don't know about as much concern as it is intrigue of going from the 80,000 to now the 91. I'd be interested to hear, just in short, how, and I fully believe there are very good reasons why we thought at 6 months ago that it was 115 after the master plan was what we would need, and now it's 91. Like, I know that you all put the time and effort in. I know there's a lot. I think I would like to know, or it'd be good to hear that, because as we sit here and say, you're now saying, which I, again, I want to get on board with that, with the 91 is what we need in 2040. But I think I share just how do we get there? How do we go from 115,000 to 91? So, and that could be shared publicly or
So that's part of what we'll share back in terms of
With this new
validating the
thing.
test fits, and so you'll see that. And we're still validating that as a staff in terms of, we just got it back.
Okay.
But we're looking at it, and it really does appear to meet those needs. And that's both changing some ways in which we look at how we use and share space, the number of things like how we do conference rooms, how we do different things. It rolls all the way through the building plan. And there's also some elements that just look at, how your building columns are and there's
Yeah.
natural space. Because 80,000 was literally whatever it was, 75 or 80,000 was literally what allows us to preserve $20 million in our capital investment model, and what does that roughly translate into the footprint of the building. Now we've done it the other way, looking at what are the departmental needs, how does that look, how does that fit within a dollar amount that still preserves that 20 million of capacity. So it's kind of, we did it
The other way.
top down, and now we've done it bottom up.
That's
And so
great.
that's how we ended up at that number. But when we have fully validated that, we will bring that to you and walk you through what that design looks like in terms of the departmental adjacencies, the public space, the office space, the other components that are all part of it. And so you'll get a sense of how that fits. The other thing we can kind of break back out, and we covered some of this when we talked in February, but we can do it in more detail, is how that breaks down, how that per square foot number is allocated.
Last question, quick, because I know others need to talk, but you mentioned that the 20-year time frame is a policy decision that we've made on how we like to pay.
How
for
you
the-
manage debt, yeah.
So I would also ask, how many $100 million projects have we had? I mean, the sewer, water.
Sanitation plan, yeah,
Sanitation.
which is a 30-year debt.
30-year debt.
Through the state, through a state loan program.
So,
It's at
and I don't
very
know if
low
that
rates.
affects, if there's geo, I would be curious to the other aldermen's opinion on this magnitude of an expense. Unexpected, frankly, with the construction costs doing what they've done. But I'd be curious to see the appetite of other aldermen
Yeah.
in looking at that policy for this project only. I mean, obviously, how we handle everything else is fantastic, and
Right.
it leads to great credit ratings. But when you look at the magnitude of this expense and how to work it in, and without the property tax changes, possibly it could bring some relief in that area.
That's the thing to look at. When you stretch it out, your annual costs are lower, your total cost of borrowing is going to be higher. So that's the trade-off that you have to think about, and what implications that has for other projects and operations and other things. So that's certainly something we can evaluate and give you a sense of, if it was 30, what would that look like? What would a scenario, all these scenarios, if we did a 30?
I want to make sure we get all the scenarios in, but I'm going to, Alderman Potts wanted to say something.
Yes, sir. I just had a very quick question. Eric, this is on what you had just said. Michael, you may have said it, about the policy being 20 years, and yet the previous loan, as Alderman Baggett just referenced, was a 30-year. Could you give us a little bit more background as why we, and Christine, maybe you're the one
It's a
that
state
gives us
revolving
that.
loan fund.
The city decided to go through the state revolving loan fund to receive the best possible interest rate, and that loan program actually has federal dollars to the state. The state leverages to help local communities with water and sewer projects, and it's actually not a it's not a traditional fixed rate public offering, so it doesn't have that. When you think about a yield curve and how the longer out you borrow, it's more expensive to borrow 30 years versus 15. If you think about a mortgage, the state revolving loan fund program is really it's a unique animal, and it is only for water and sewer. It's not set up for school buildings or anything like that. So it's got tailor-made options to choose from, and so that was not really an intention to deviate from city policy. Is that we borrowed less than 2%. I mean, we borrowed closer to 1% on much of that debt for that 30 years, and that's not possible in the public markets, even for anything other than that one program. So it was an opportunity that we had on water and sewer that was wonderful for that water and sewer utility, but it's not available for something such as this.
And it essentially does buy down that rate, like Christine said, closer to 1%. My memory is it saved us over the life of that loan, will save us over $30 million of borrowing costs than what we would have gotten if we'd gone a traditional route with a revenue bond.
And I will mention, too, that state program that's very specific also allows you to prepay without penalty because it's not a traditional public offering. So somewhere, if the water and sewer utility spun money off years down the road, you could prepay. But with traditional debt that we're talking about for tax exempt on the GO, you issue fixed rate debt and you have a call period. The investors are protected typically for 10 years, and so you can't just prepay anytime you want to. You have to line up prepayment with these call options. So it's just a different type of debt that's available. That was just for the water and sewer.
Let's keep rolling as far as seeing some more scenarios.
All right. Scenario 2 is pretty straightforward. It is just building the full master plan at 115,700 square feet. It has the updated cost associated with it. It is also, again, the 20-year level annual payment component, and using the tax-exempt approach. You see it right here. It exceeds what our capacity is currently projected. One way you could do that is to look at your property tax rate and how you dedicate it. You may recall in 2016, we came around a reappraisal, reevaluation that happens, and we held our rate, and that created about a dime of property tax we called Invest Franklin, and we used that towards capital investment projects. This project syncs up with that reappraisal that will happen, well, now 4 years out, 3 years out, as we're counting, that you could look at a similar approach there to not only look at City Hall, but other capital projects as you evaluate it. You could look at how you set or reset your rate, and dedicate some of it to your capital, additional component to your capital program. Think of it an Invest Franklin Part 2. That is an option that you could consider. City Hall could be folded into that. Other projects could be too. As we move into the fall, we'll start talking more again about the overall 10-year capital plan, and that's just something to keep in mind. But it's going to require you to find capacity somewhere. And our estimate is that's about 2.3 cents of property tax as it stands today that you would need to meet those obligations. It was 10 cents, but of that 10 cents, 7 cents were the capital investment program and 3 cents were the operations. So, Michael, anything else you want to add?
It's scenario 1, but more expensive, and you need more money to cover it. That's essentially scenario 2.
Michael.
Sir.
Would you recommend a referendum on a 2.3 cent property tax increase to build City Hall? Would you do that?
That would be your decision.
That is
not
your
ours.
decision, and that is why you get to sit in your seat and I get to sit in mine, Alderman.
To be clear, you are not required to do a referendum to establish your annual property tax rate.
But you have to
have
have
that
the
choice.
referendum. You have to have the referendum.
To lend credit. It's a
To lend
different
credit.
animal.
I'm sorry, okay.
It's a different animal.
Next scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is simply, scenario 2 is simply what you do today, but you would need additional revenue than we believe is in your current financial model to accommodate it. So therefore, that revenue needs to come from somewhere else. Should you choose to raise the property taxes to do it, it would be 2.3 cents thereabouts, given the current rate or current value of 1 cent of property tax.
And that would start when?
It would
Whenever we
start-
started the building?
well, I would suggest you do it with the reappraisal, which is three fiscal years out now. We're in the midst of the first year. It's now on a 4-year reappraisal cycle. The county changed that from 5 years to 4 years. So that happens to sync up pretty well with this project. So I would suggest that would make sense for you. But you could do it anytime. Because it is a public building, you can directly utilize the property tax calculation. You don't get into the complexity that you'll see in 3A and 3B. You have that ability if you should so choose.
3A and 3B.
All right, these are the ones that integrate the commercial use. And the elements that Lillian and Lauren described are the backbone of how we would deliver the project. As I said, it's the same footprint. It's the option 1 plus the commercial space in both these, but we use a range of construction costs. Mr. Gibbs had a lower cost. We worked essentially from that same number, get to about the same place. It's slightly different, but it's essentially the same place in 3A. And 3B is a little closer to what we're paying across the rest of the building. It's still a little lower, but it's, so we adjusted that accordingly to kind of give you a bracket on it, what we think it might be and how that might play out over the lifespan of it. And I'll let Michael kind of walk through those elements.
Okay, so on your screen right now, and both 3A and 3B, basically, we've tried to make it as simple as possible, and thus it's color-coded. So, the municipal office costs and the tax exempt are blue. The taxable bonds and that controlled by the IDB and issued through the IDB are in orange. Okay? Just as a general following of the spreadsheet. This slide and the first part, like I said, scenario 3A and B from the municipal office standpoint is exactly scenario 1. The only add-on to this slide from scenario 1 is simply to explicitly state that this would be controlled by you, the city of Franklin. Okay? Scenario 3A. This assumes an overall square foot cost of $607, not $921. Now, the immediate thing to keep in mind is that it should be less expensive to build out the commercial space because we will not be building it out to the full extent that we will the municipal offices. We will not be buying the furniture. We will not be painting the shops. We will not, so we will not have the same degree of soft costs that we will to outfit a new city hall. The 607, just like the 921, come from our cost estimators and our architects. You will note, you saw the email from Eric, I think last night, that identified that the total amounts of per square footage in figures 5 and figures 6 on pages 4 and 5 of the Gibbs report total to $607 per square foot when you add the hard cost and the soft cost together. The breakout of square footage doesn't quite, so don't look at that in their report, that the overall totals do break down to 607, and that's what we've put here. The total construction cost would be roughly $23 million is what you would have to borrow, or a total financing cost of $38 million. The interest rate we have assumed, again, we could not give you an idea of what the bond rating would be, but it is 6.17%. That is roughly 37% higher than the city's rate. Will it be that high? No. Is that a conservative estimate? Yes. But the best way to simply understand it is if you look at taxable rates in the country, the highest income tax bracket is 37%. And so without knowing what the rating would be and not knowing who would buy these bonds from the IDB, we have given you the most conservative projection we could in terms of the costs. Taxable rate issued again, level payments for 20 years. Owned and operated and issued through the Franklin IDB. Both scenario 3A and 3B will require someone to cover the shortfall. The shortfall is simply how much it's going to cost to service annual level debt payments and what the net revenues can be from these projects. And that is this rather large orange-covered box here that begins with the phrase offsetting revenue potential on these two pages, 7 and 9. Walking through that, you have your office square footage and your rental rates. The rental rates for the office and the retail come directly from the Gibbs report. We are not office and retail market experts. They are. So we have assumed exactly their assumption of $45 per square foot for office, $35 per square foot for the retail. We have waited to assume that rents will not start to come in at least until year 3. Why? You can't rent what you physically don't have. So we have to borrow the money first to build it, and then rents will start to come in. We've also been conservative, saying that by year 5, you'd be at the 95% leasing. And we have assumed full 95% leasing throughout the rest of this assumption. The other thing we have done is we have assumed a 2% increase per year on those rents. So the revenues are going up by 2%, so are the operating costs and the expenses. Do not ask what inflation's going to be at that point in time, because none of us can give you that crystal ball. If we did, we'd probably be in other lines of work. You have column L on this screen, which then, after you've totaled your rental income, is the operating and cost. That also comes from the Gibbs report. The exact operating costs will be dependent upon who is hired as a property manager and what other ancillary costs will need to be maintained, which the revenues obviously would go to pay to operate and maintain that building. The only thing that does not come from the Gibbs report is our added column M, which is the costs of the IDB. The IDB, as it is currently constituted, does not have the capacity to engage in this type of activity. And by that I mean you're going to need to add an audit and pay for an audit component annually. You're going to need to make sure you've got the proper legal staffing. You're going to need someone to be a bookkeeper at bare minimum for staffing. And so what we have assumed is a $50,000 initial and then $25,000 a year that also goes up at that 2% inflation. It's a starting place but it's at least a place that we acknowledged that we were going to need to try to get to. What does that mean in the end? It means that you'd have an annual subsidy of between $500,000 and $1.9 million. Highest at the beginning, lowest obviously as time goes on because rents are going to continue to increase. Your debt service is going to get paid down. We estimate that this would be a 32-year payback from that initial investment of roughly $18 million. And we have labeled it here a diversion of sales tax, given all of the discussion that you've just had and listened to regarding the complexities of how you do not or can allocate property tax. That's scenario 3A. Shall I go on to 3B? Okay. 3B is the same as 3A, except it costs more. 3B assumes what I would consider to be the high end, or the most conservative cost, borrowing the exact same square footage cost of the municipal building. I will tell you, I don't think that that's probably accurate. I don't think it would cost $921 to outfit that, but we wanted to give you the maximum, what I would consider optimistic and more reasonable, and then the high-end range of what those costs would be. That changes the overall borrowing from $23 million to almost $35 million in overall costs. The total financing goes up to $57.6 million. You do partially offset because the rental assumptions do not change. So you still have that $19.8 million of rents assumed over really 18 years, but certainly the 20-year period. Taxable bonds, again owned by and issued by the IDB. The subsidy required to cover those annual shortfalls would range from a high of $2.9 million to a low of $1.5 million, which nets you a payback of 42 years in order to do this. The summary assumptions on this slide, and then I'll turn it back over certainly to questions and to Eric. To reiterate, all assumptions on the rental earnings, the leasable space, and operational costs have been taken from the Gibbs report, and they are cited within our scenarios for you to be able to reference. The assumptions on the financing structure, the legal obligations have come from city staff and everyone seated at this table, our bond counsel and our financial advisors. The mixed-use office retail building would be issued and owned by the IDB. The city would own the municipal office portion and still the land underneath it because we would build a garage underneath it. As we have discussed, it would seem logical that the city would be the backstop, that the city would be the ones to provide that annual subsidy. And the ranges, as you see on the screen, is between $18.2 and $37.8 million with a payback of, as I said, 32 to 42 years. We have deemed that and our objective professional subjectivity to be a moderate high risk to you, compared to issuing bonds as we normally would at a low risk with the tax exempt only. Eric?
I think that pretty well covers it. The point that came through the legal discussion is we'd have to really allocate sales tax to cover that gap. And so typically you use sales tax to pay for operations, for other capital projects. So you're kind of putting another demand on that source that you don't have right now. And so that's just the mechanics of how it would have to work as we described before. But I think Michael covered it well, and we're glad to answer any questions. I think of these as a bracket. It's probably somewhere in between those, most likely. Maybe a little closer to 3A than 3B, but we wanted to give you the full range just so you could see that perspective.
Go ahead, Alderman Hanson.
So we talk about the sales tax revenue and needing to allocate some of that towards this, but we're not talking about the massive amount of newly generated sales tax that would come from the retail component in this building that could probably, in and of itself, offset that additional cost. We don't know. That's a hypothetical number. We'll never know until it really happens.
Right.
But we do have to make that assumption that it could be a self-sustaining value.
I think professionally that's a stretch.
It takes a lot of sales.
It takes a lot of sales tax, and you're only generating $17,100 worth of retail sales tax space. The office would not have a sales tax generation component
I don't
on
know
it.
that, I don't know that I agree with adding office space in the market that we're in. I am leaning far more towards retail, which is the tax
Correct.
generator, which is what he said we were 180,000 square feet short on. And we want to maximize this ground level space, which is the highest per square foot rate in the entire, probably almost Middle Tennessee, but definitely in Williamson County. We want to revenue that towards ourselves to offset this debt, and that's how we do it. Office space is a loss leader. It doesn't bring us that continual stream of revenue that we need as a city.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Alderman
we could
Baggett.
run some numbers that might show what kind of sales you need to generate
Unless
to do
anyone else
that.
wants to pipe in, I've got a few comments. One, I want us to step back again, back to our original, where we started on this. And we started at 78,000 square feet, and with the full build out to 115 for our needs. And, you know, the thought was we'll build the extra office space and sublease it, and then we'll take it over as we need it, because we will need 115,000 square feet at some point. That was. So here's where we are, and that's okay. Here's where we are now. We need, from that original proposal, 78,000. Now it's 91,000, which is great. So if we were following the same logic, not building more than we need, I never set out to try and build as much office space or retail or whatever here. The whole point was to build what we needed for the future and possibly have something that can help us offset some of the costs. That was the whole, I think that was generally everyone's. And it kind of has transpired, as things have transpired, this has grown. So that would be a total of 91,000 square feet that we would say, so that 11,000 square foot difference from that time, and I know things have changed. So what I don't see on any of these options, now I'm looking at, 129,000 square foot option. It was about 20, it was just 18 or 9, how many more square feet?
Yeah, that reflects the square footage that the Gibbs report recommended, which is the 38,000 square feet. So that's his report added on to option one.
Yeah. No. I think what we got to get back to what our original intent on this was, which was building what City Hall needed, trying to find a creative way. I would rename your column of annual subsidy required to the city's cost for this, because it is, you could call it a subsidy, but I'm looking at this as the city's going to pay $18 million for a $37 million debt and interest of a building. Now that's what we're having to pay. They're paying the rest of it. So call it a subsidy if you want, but we're getting on this example, a 38,000 square foot building for $18 million. That's what we're getting. So I think that's what we got. So this is not crazy. It's really not. Maybe from the municipal bond side of things, we have constraints that obviously limit us from this kind of in my opinion, economy that we would save the taxpayers $20 million on a building that's 30,000 square feet. So I think we need to keep where we started and where we are now in mind, and not grow this thing into a 130,000 square foot building that kind of gets us a little bit away from where we were. And then finally, I don't want to be remiss that also when we talked about at least when I talked about the retail, it was in the context of activating Third Avenue in such a way that brought people down there. It wasn't to commercialize the neighborhood or commercialize that block necessarily. But it's that if we're this entire block is very central, obviously it's in the square, to our downtown's environ. And so I think it's kind of a mistake not to have some kind of commercial down on this block in some way. Now, whether it's this or it's another option where we think creatively, possibly, we don't ever want to be in the business of running commercial. Maybe we have space that we sell, or that is just, we just We sell the space to a private enterprise, and we don't have to deal with the bond situation. We should never be in the business of operating a retail location. The city of Franklin should never be, even leasing it. I mean, but we gotta look, those are the goals. The goals were to economize the public taxpayers' dollars on building City Hall, help pay for it by possibly subleasing, the character of the area, making sure it's activated, and expanding this to, I would disagree with the Gibbs Group. We don't need 40,000 square foot of retail down here. I think it needs to be appropriate, and maybe it's 10. But I think we need to look at, I don't see anything here that hits exactly nail on the head where I think we should end up, and that may be frustrating for staff. But I think this has gotten us a step closer, but I think there's a little bit more work to do, but I appreciate it.
Alderman Brown?
Sure.
I think you wanted to speak.
I didn't, but I will. I will.
My
Thank you.
mistake.
Thank you for my opportunity. That's good. That's good. I have been quiet through the scenarios. This is, I agree with the step back because for me, the thought always was offsetting the cost of what the city hall needed to be in the short term, maybe even, and at some point maybe that evolved. I'm in agreement. I don't know that office space right now is a worthwhile investment. I would not go that path. There's just too much vacancy, downtown and Cool Spring area. But what's not happening here, I get the math of we're getting, a $40,000 building or $40 million building for $18 million, but that's an additional building that we don't need beyond City Hall. So we're actually still spending $20 million or whatever, right? We're still spending more money than we need to spend for the, so in this scenarios, we've actually not accomplished the goal that I think we were originally setting out to do, which is if we need to build a 115 square foot building, how do we get some of that paid for through some retail? All we're really doing is paying for the retail space that we're building that we don't really need to build to accomplish a city hall at 91,000 square feet. So I feel like we've sort of attacked the goal and then just went flying right on past it at this point. And I'm having, as much as I do choke a little bit at $100 million, we don't have many options here. This building is not only is it not reflective of Franklin and our community, this is certainly not a building I would hold up and say, have you been to Franklin? Check out our city hall. Not only does it not reflect that, it's not even functionally appropriate. So we got to do something. We have to do something, and we are growing, and we're going to have to continue to do something. So I'm actually going and leaning back towards a scenario 1 at this point, because scenario 3A and 3B, while I'm intrigued by the retail opportunity, and I would love to see all retail and not office in terms of the tax implications, again, I feel like all we're doing is using that to pay for square footage that we don't even really need. It's not actually offsetting any cost for us on the city hall part. So anyway, that's kind of where my head is. So,
I might interject one comment and go back to the original public input and a little bit of response to Alderman Baggett's comment is that the input we had from the citizens, they didn't want to see any commercial or retail space in City Hall. There's going to be a lot more opportunity for the public to weigh in as we continue to move forward on the project, and we'll see whether that attitude changes or improves as the vision is cast on what the new City Hall will be. So just something to put in the back of your mind. And so go ahead, Alderman Barnhill.
I can make mine pretty brief. Right now, if we had to pick, I'm picking scenario 1. I'm not interested, I don't think, in 3B, 3C, 3D, 4E, or whatever. But I also find it interesting that the comment was made about bringing people down here to see this city hall. I can't imagine why somebody would come and visit the new city hall unless as many restrooms as we're putting in there, I have an idea why they're coming to City Hall. But they're not, City Hall is not a visitor center. It's not somebody that's come down here to see something that's that's historical. It should be functional, that's for sure. It should be functional. And it should be enough space to accommodate the people who work here. I'm going to say this, and I'll probably say it once or twice again. I do not believe in any shape, form, or fashion that City Hall needs to evolve into what it is, because I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think you're going to have more people working from home. I think you're going to have more people functioning not in the manner of coming down here to pick up a yard sale sign or to pay a traffic ticket.
Okay.
I guess you could pay a traffic ticket. I do not believe, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, I do not believe that this is the right location for City Hall. Do not believe this is the right location. I don't think you put City Hall in the middle and own the most valuable piece of property in Franklin within a mile radius of the statue. And that's just the way I look at it. Now, if the rest of the board wants to do this, I'll support project scenario 1 because I think it's the most functional with the least cost. And I think it's what we looked at and what we expected when we did the capital improvements project budget, probably in 2019, and a $24 million budget on that. So I will do that, but I don't think this is the right location. And we spent $80,000 on a Gibbs report. There may have been some numbers in there we can use, but I don't think it was worth $80,000.
If it's okay with everybody, Eric's got, I'm
There's
going
one
to
more
recognize
slide.
Alderman Berger, and then I want Eric to give his summation slide, because we're obviously going to come back to this again. So go ahead, Alderman Berger.
Yeah, I've got some other things, but I think I'm going to hold them. But, you know, I really would like to see some aspect of a commercial area, and I totally agree. We really need to go retail. It can't be office, because that's not going to bring us what we need. But, you know, we are living in the 21st century. Things are changing. Clyde's right, change like a blink of an eye. We really don't know what some of the future is going to bring. But the digital world is creating a whole new scenario that does not bring people into City Hall as much as they used to, but it is still a central area of our community. And as we have fought with the digital world anymore, I mean, parents, organizations, churches, everybody's fighting with the digital world. There's always this rub. And we're coming to a point in our lives where we're getting so disconnected that honestly, if I had a crystal ball, I would say we're going to make that 100-degree 80 turn no matter what we're going to do in the digital world, and we're going to finally come back to community. And I think this is going to be a central located place, and I would totally support it being downtown, because facts and research show all day long, and if you go back and research it to the hilt, you will find that when City Hall's center of your town, your focus on City Hall has moved out of the downtown, these downtowns, especially the historic ones and the smaller cities under 200,000, have greatly suffered and have not done as well. And there are multiple cases within the last 6 to 10 years of these city halls moving back to the squares and moving back to the cities, back into the heart of their cities. So I'd say we would very well be very cautious about what we do there. And I do believe that I would personally like to see a commercial aspect of it, but if in the long run it's not going to bring us enough revenue to offset it, then we need to reevaluate that.
Okay, I'm going to
That's
let
all.
Eric finish up on the last slide.
I'm going to share with you my
then
oh, sorry.
Stop.
Yeah, okay. I'll share with you my recommendation based on what we know today, and then talk about next steps. Yeah, I really believe that option one, scenario one, is the best approach. It meets our needs now and in the future, but allows and preserves capacity to do other things. As important as I believe City Hall is, I also know we got streets to build and parks to build and operations to support in one of the fastest growing cities in America. So I think we got to keep that in mind. I was originally, and staff will tell you, I was an advocate for commercial space because I believe in the activity it creates, but that was just the assumption it would help shave costs off of the project itself. It doesn't. It costs us more. Every year it costs us more. We can run some other scenarios with lesser, and you can look at it, but it does create an obligation for us that takes away from paying for operations or paying for other projects we need. And as much as I don't want to say that, that's what the numbers tell me. And I think that's what needs to guide us. It fits our existing financial capacity and preserves that $20 million of unprogrammed money that we're going to need without us having to go and obligate ourselves to a tax increase or some other change that frees up money to support that new annual obligation that we're going to face, and then still take us in whole, both the gap we fill and then paying ourselves back over 30 years to get that done if we build out that full amount of commercial space. Now, we could build less. We can run a 115 scenario or something like that does that. I think it will lower the number, but the story will still be the same. We'll have an annual obligation that we're facing that we just will have to consider, and I think, to me, makes that not a viable option long term. The other piece is having that flexibility for the future. I get that it will cost us more to build space in the future, but I think we'll also know better what we need. Just think of how much our concept of work has changed in just the last 2 years. I think it would be presumptuous to say that we'll know exactly how to build out 115 now to meet our needs 20 and 30 and 40 years from now. And so while we might pay more 20 or 30 years from now when we need to add space, we'll know better what we need to add and how we need to add it. And I think there's benefit to that. And I think that is in and of itself important as we move forward. I welcome your direction on how you want to move forward with further discussion on this. Let's look at our next steps just broadly as we have them. We need to address any questions, additional information you need. I welcome that feedback. We can revisit this. We can run some other scenarios if you'd like to see us run those, go back through some of these elements, answer and more fully some of the questions we heard tonight. So we're committed to do that and keep chipping away at that over work sessions over the next couple months. We will provide you that test fit scenario, I would guess probably in October, because we need a little time to work through it and validate it, and then you can see it and give us your feedback, but we'll get it to you as soon as we're comfortable walking through that. And then once you're able to identify the scenario that you're comfortable with, then we can really go to the next stage of that schematic design and go forward, but you've got to be comfortable with that decision. So tell us what you need to get there, and we will continue to work on that. And I welcome other feedback that you have and how we bring this back around for more discussion and ultimately your guidance. So thank you.
I think I'd like to thank staff for the hard work and all the information that they've provided us with, and the legal expertise from Lillian and the financial expertise from Lauren, and we appreciate them being here and appreciate everybody's input, and we'll continue to work on it, and we'll see you in about 12 to 15 minutes.